Hey, warm and friendly hello! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in segment number 2 by one of our good friends, Blake Lovell, who does such excellent work over at Southeastern 16, looking at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. We're going to chat with him about the week that was for the SEC in terms of the NBA draft decisions, the surprises, what we were sort of expecting, how these rosters are coming together, and which of these teams out there in the SEC might be in the Milan Mimicelovic sweepstakes. I'm looking at you, Kentucky in particular, and how that is going to be gauged as well. We'll also talk about just what is still going on with LSU. They have a lot of guys are probably not going to be getting eligibility for the upcoming season, so a big giant ball of wax there. We're going to have some fun chatting about that and then so much more. And in the final segment, we didn't have a lot of news and notes in college basketball over the last 24 hours, but we did have a few signings. We're going to recap those and probably going to get a lot of two-part podcasts here moving forward. As this is going to be a short segment, number one, I just want to give you guys a lowdown on the fact that those conference previews I do every single offseason, they are on the horizon because we are getting much less college basketball news and notes. That is probably going to be not a segment that I do at the back half of podcasts very much longer, just because we're not getting a whole heck of a lot of signings anymore. So you're going to be getting more conference previews, and then there's going to be more recaps of the last few days in college basketball on these podcasts as well. So be on the lookout there. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. And I beg of you, I plead with you, please do send these in. It'll make the offseason go by much, much faster. First way is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated. Then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Yep, I always want to make sure that with regards to those conference previews that we know what we're getting out of these teams. We know that these rosters are relatively close to set. There's always going to be some pieces of news, some eligibility concerns, what have you, with regards to some of these guys. And sometimes with these smaller conferences like the America East, the MEAC, the SWAC, a lot of their rosters are a big giant question mark. They don't release them until very, very late in the offseason. So sometimes I just have to take my best guess with regards to those, but you're going to be getting those conference previews relatively soon. Typically, I aim for the first week of June. It might be the second week of June because the transfer portal, it did open up a little bit later on here in the offseason. It wasn't open until after the NCAA tournament was all concluded. Typically, it was open a little bit earlier, so might be starting up a week or two later, but you're going to get my projector finish for all 32 of these conferences, and we are back up to 32 conferences. Thank you to the Pac-12 for being reinvigorated and being reborn, so that's going to be great. And what else is going to be great? Our chat with Blake right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Side edge this college basketball season? Well, VSiN experts use CBB Analytics, the most comprehensive college basketball analytics platform in the world. See injury impact, on and off data, clutch time performance metrics, first versus second half splits, and so much more. Utilize the promo code of VSiN, that is VSIN, to get $30 off and find your betting edge over at cbbanalytics.com. That is cbbanalytics, all one word.com. For anyone that is new to VSiN, well, I wish you a friendly hello. This is an attention to anyone that is new to VSiN because you're able to get some free stuff with our daily newsletter. It's a great way to catch up on everything that's happening in the sports betting world. It's delivered straight to your inbox every single morning. VSiN's newsletter offers picks, data, strategies for the day's betting menu, and so much more. Sign up for free today over at VSiN.com/newsletter. That's VSIN.com/newsletter, and start receiving your free newsletter tomorrow morning. That is VSIN.com/newsletter. Stay ahead of the game and bet smarter with VSiN. Back to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. Always great to be joined by this man as we've got Blake Lovell aboard. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16, looking at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. He, all 12 months of the year, is very much dialed in on what we're seeing. I know he did a great job in terms of recapping all these NBA draft decisions and so much more. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell. And Blake, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks as always for having me, Greg.
it's always great to get you aboard. And just a few days ago, we got all the NBA draft decisions in the books. And I feel like we talked about this on the podcast last time you were on, and I still feel like very rightfully so. The biggest decisions, they were out there in the SEC. And how would you say, as a conference, the SEC fared? Because I felt like it was a little bit of a mixed bag. I would have liked to see Malik Thomas stay at Arkansas, but I felt like other than that decision, a lot of them went the way of the SEC teams.
Yeah, I agree. I think overall, Malachi Moreno returning to Kentucky was pretty significant just based on kind of what we've thought about Kentucky's roster to this point. I know they'll probably come up here in just a minute when we talk about another certain someone who's still out there available. But, Billy Richmond coming back to Arkansas was substantial, of course. But, I would say certainly the two biggest ones are probably the two guys who will be, the SEC preseason player of the year favorites with Thomas Houck and Tyler Tanner, both returning to their teams. It would have seemed like that may have been a long shot 2 months ago. Both come back. Florida gets Chinyalu back. And so Florida is certainly one of the biggest winners just based on, getting their big three guys back in the fold and then, potentially getting that backcourt of Boogie Flan and Denzel Aberdeen, should he be able to get a waiver and all that. And then I think, for Arkansas, I said going in for them, you felt like if you just got a 50-50 split with Thomas and Richmond, you feel pretty good about things. Again, best case scenario, you would have gotten both back, but I still think Arkansas is in a position to be a top 15 team entering the year. And that's where, again, a decision like a Tyler Tanner returning to Vanderbilt, that puts them in that same conversation. Yeah, to me, those were the biggest ones. Alabama, of course, got a nice boost with Amari Allen coming back. Now, I think you certainly look at Alabama as a team that I was probably a little bit hesitant on and didn't have a great read on him. But having him back in the fold, you can just kind of see the depth that's starting to emerge there. So, yeah, those were definitely the biggest ones. And overall, I think a pretty big positive for the SEC.
Yep, I'm right there with you. I thought that this was a very good last few days for the SEC as well, and I do think that it's going to be interesting to see the ripple effects of what we saw here, because one decision that in a way affected the SEC was the fact that Alan Graves decided to stay in the NBA draft. We know that he was linked to LSU, which, boy, I hope that LSU has some contingency plans if they don't get the waivers. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that said, the other big one was Milan Mimicevic. He decides that he is going to be returning to school, and have to think that he knows that he's going to get a lot of money for returning to school, perhaps from a school out there in Kentucky, whether that be Louisville, whether that be Kentucky. Obviously, St. John's is throwing around a lot of money as well. How do you take a look at his sweepstakes? Because that's in the SEC, that's in the ACC, and I feel like every year there's some shocking team that comes up with a large sum of money for a player, like Washington for Great Osabor a few years ago, and maybe there's a mystery team out there as well.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's one where if you just look at Kentucky's roster, now that Moreno comes back, you feel a little bit better about things. And I still would say there's a lot still that I would probably like about some of the other teams that we just mentioned, whether it's Florida, Arkansas, Vanderbilt. Then there's the obvious ones, I think, with Tennessee and Texas. Both feel like preseason top 15 at worst teams. I mean, more like maybe top 10 potentially with those two. And so you're seeing these teams are adding up here. And I don't quite put Kentucky still in that mix just yet, unless you bring in Milan. And if you bring him into the mix, then all of a sudden you take a team that has two very capable scorers in the backcourt to go along with the best shooter in the country, the number one available transfer. Then you've got a breakout star in Moreno. You've got good depth and size in the front court, I think. And so now you're starting to see the pieces coming together. And that's where, like, for all the pushback people may have about Mark Pope, the one thing I will not push back on is how good he can be as an offensive coach when he has a guy that can knock down threes the way that, Milan could. And so I think from that standpoint, that would be the thing that all of a sudden puts Kentucky into a different stratosphere to me. Still a little hesitant as of right now, but if you really look at it, it would seem like this is an easy sell. And we were kind of laughing about this on our show earlier. We're like, if you're Kentucky and let's say you've got an Arizona who all of a sudden is coming to the mix here, it's an easy pitch to them. Hey, guess what? Arizona doesn't like to shoot threes. We will shoot a ton of threes. And so why don't you just come play for us in Lexington, because it's a very easy thing to do. And so I have kid about that. They would obviously let him shoot a lot if he goes to Tucson. But I think overall, it does feel like Kentucky's the best fit for him. But again, money talks, Greg, as you just said. And it's probably going to be a matter of, who is the team that's paying north of $7 million or whatever that winds up being.
Yeah, hard to believe that we were talking about a decade ago about players and teams being reprimanded for giving a guy like peanut butter with a free bagel. And now we're talking about Milan Misalovic getting like $7 million. How things have changed as Blake Lovell, who does such great work over at Southeastern 16, is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And certainly the NBA draft decisions have been big, but we haven't talked a lot about this team here in the offseason. It feels like they've been the Rodney Dangerfield of the offseason here in the SEC. That would be Missouri. They return a few guys here in the offseason. It really does feel like Dennis Gates has changed around his system because you recall as well as I did, first few years over at Missouri, Missouri was really good in terms of shooting threes, the backcourt, and man, were they getting plowed down low. They did a much better job with their rebounding last year. Now they've got the likes of Trent Pierce, Bryson Tiller, who they bring in from Kansas down low. How do you take a look at this Missouri team? Because they also had a little bit of an under-the-radar ad, actually a pair of them, in Cord Stansbury and Jordan Crawford, to be able to help out a backcourt that I did have some question marks with going into the month of May, and even those got resolved here.
Yeah, I think, something else too. I feel like Missouri maybe has the most full roster right now. If we look at all the SEC teams, it feels like they have got every single spot that is pretty much taken. I think maybe Auburn might be the closest team to them. If I just look at it on paper, Tennessee's probably pretty close now too. A&M as well, I guess. We are starting to see full rosters come together, so it's a nice thing at this point. But I think with Missouri, I think certainly you're leaning on the same trope that you usually do. Like, they have a ton of size. And even though, like you said, it hasn't always equated into being a great rebounding team, being a great team inside, I feel like this feels like on paper one of Dennis Gates' most high upside teams in the front court in terms of you feel like you've got that combination of size and ability to be able to attack some of those areas that you have been weak in. Like we mentioned, rebounding at times has not been the easiest thing. Interior defense, those are things too that I think, as we know in the SEC, very important, just because historically it has been a league where there are so many plays that are made in the paint, at the rim. So I think by having the combination of guys, whether it is, someone that's kind of an SEC veteran at this point in Jalen Carey, you've got Pierce, you've got Bryant, Tiller, Burns, like all those guys, they're all 6'10" or taller. And I think when you look at their size too that they have on the perimeter, you've got a 6'6" guard in Jameer Jones. You've got Davis. You've got these guys who can score. And then, oh, by the way, you should have one of the best freshmen in the SEC and Jason Crow coming in, who is probably going to have a chance to be a pretty prolific scorer on this team. So I think Missouri's got a lot to like here. And I think they brought in plenty of scoring, but they've also fixed some of those areas that I think have kind of been nagging for them in recent years. And specifically, I think that's the interior play and the rebounding specifically. I would think that Missouri right now, if you are comparing them to some of these top tier SEC teams, I'd probably still put them behind that top group. But to me, they're right there in that conversation. You start to get into maybe that group right after that first 4 or 5.
Absolutely. As right now, that top 4 or 5 is still a bit of a mystery as well, as Blake, because we don't know the roster of LSU still. I do think that in the month of June, we're going to get a little bit more clarity, but how are you trying to gauge this team right now? Because I still come to the conclusion that there's no way RJ Lewis could be eligible. Like, there's just absolutely no way. When your On3 graphic has multiple NBA teams, that should automatically disqualify you from eligibility. I know they tried it with Charles Bediako last season, and we saw how that went, but it's just still one of the strangest things ever, because some of these international guys, like the 19-year-old that they signed, that's all well and good and everything like that, but it's been about 2 weeks since we saw a lot of these announcements from LSU, and I still can't believe what we've just seen.
Yeah, like you said, I think LSU is the biggest unknown of all the SEC teams, probably the biggest unknown nationally, because it is one where if you compare what they could have on the positive side versus what they could have on the negative side, they're just completely opposite ends. And I feel like that's something where if they were to get the majority of these guys eligible, and again, RJ Lewis, I just don't anticipate him even being a factor here. Now, I could be completely wrong, but that to me is the hardest one to gauge, because I'm like, I feel like there is not a high chance. The other international players, I could absolutely see many different arguments and potential legal things that go into them being eligible, but I don't anticipate that at the moment. And so if you're looking at the upside, there's no doubt that LSU has a top 5 SEC upside if all these guys are playing, maybe top 3. And to some people that may sound extreme, but that's how good some of these international players are. And it's easy to say, well, look at the hit rate, right? The SEC, when it comes to international players, even in college, sometimes it can take a little bit for it to adjust. But some of these guys are not like a lot of these international players that have come in. Some of these guys are really, really good. They're older. They're legit. Like, you're going to have a hard time looking at these guys and saying, yeah, he's probably going to come in and be a bench player in the SEC. Not going to happen. Some of these guys are going to be very good and very standout type performers. But as you said, on the flip side of that is, what happens if half of those guys can't play? Then, it's hard to really know exactly what you're going to get with them. But at the same time, can I see a season where LSU goes in and maybe doesn't have a full roster and they're just building up all this money, all this cash that they've spent on these international players, Greg? And guess what they're going to have going into next year? That same allotment to pull from and then some. So could you just kind of punt year one while taking a big risk? I could absolutely see them doing that and basically taking all that money that they may be shelling out for these international players and just saying, oh, well, didn't work out. Maybe we just kind of have a decent year, but next year there's no one in the country that is going to have more of a stockpile to choose from than us. Maybe that's how they're going to play it.
That would be very, very interesting to say the least. And that's something that I think goes a little bit lost on people, because when you bring in Lane Kiffin as well on the football side of things, there's a lot of Canes money, if you will, over at LSU right now. So that's a lot of fun to say the least. As our good friend Blake Lovell, who does such great work over at Southeastern 16, is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And obviously those are teams of intrigue. And you just take a look up and down the board at the SEC, and I think that there's a lot of fascination. And here's a pair of teams that we haven't talked a lot about, the Mississippi schools, Mississippi State and Ole Miss. How do you take a look at these two teams? Because it just really feels like for Mississippi State under Chris Jans, they are always really good when they're doing a great job on the glass. I don't know where that rebounding is going to come from this year. I still don't necessarily see the three-point shooting for them as well, even with bringing back Joshua Hubbard. And for Ole Miss, obviously, things were a little bit of a failed experiment last season. I know that a lot of places have them ranked as one of the bottom teams of the SEC coming into the year as of right now with the way that they built their roster, but I actually see upside with them. But I do think that those two Mississippi schools are schools that are not getting talked about a lot, and I think that Ole Miss could be a good surprise. And for Mississippi State, I just don't know what's happened to them over the last few years.
Yeah, and you do wonder, right, if that's just simply a spending race type thing where maybe it's just a matter of, do they have the spending that a lot of these other teams do? And I tend to believe they don't. And I think that, again, has probably been a bigger issue there, maybe for Mississippi State more so than Ole Miss, because, and it's nothing like compare and contrast the coaches. Sure, like Chris Beard's been to a national championship game, Chris Jans hasn't, but we've said up until last year, Chris Jans was about as consistent as it gets when it came to kind of figuring out what exactly he was going to get out of his rosters. But I would tend to believe that Ole Miss may have a little bit more to work with there. But, these are two rosters where if you're comparing it on paper, you're just taking stats and comparing it to some of these other teams we talked about. They're not really going to be in the same department there when it comes to just comparing as a whole. Of course, the one thing Mississippi State has that Ole Miss doesn't have is Josh Hubbard. And I think anytime you have him, who will probably be your third guy you're putting in the SEC Player of the Year race with Tanner and Houck, you've got a guy that could legitimately go for 30 on any given night. That may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing for Mississippi State. You just don't know, because it really depends on how some of these other guys are going to develop. And I think last year it just felt like, going in, you had a pretty good idea that this was not going to be that typical Mississippi State team. It wasn't built the same way of kind of the teams that had succeeded before under Jans. I think this one gets a little bit closer to that, but still, I have questions about kind of the offensive distribution after Hubbard. I have questions about some of the stuff in the front court, even though they've got decent depth there, I think. And then with Ole Miss, finished the season so strong, but a lot of those guys were able to just go elsewhere. They transferred out. You get Comrade back, get Patton Pinkins back. I think that's a nice combination to have back in the mix. But elsewhere, I think there are questions when it comes to what exactly they're going to be able to produce. And maybe the one thing we always say, right, what is the thing that's going to separate some of these teams? Like, we know what that is with Florida. We know what that is with Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas, and so forth, right? We know what it is when you look at these rosters and say they're going to be outstanding in that area. They're going to be great here, good there, and so forth. With these two in particular, it's really hard to kind of identify what are the things that are going to separate these two teams. It used to just be, well, Chris Beard defensively, right? His teams are going to play better defensively than anybody else. This will be a good defensive team. Will it be a great defensive team? I don't know. Mississippi State, it's kind of the same thing. How does Jans' teams play? Well, they're pretty hard-nosed. They're going to rebound. Their front court's going to kind of stifle you a little bit. I don't know if that's going to be the case, again, with this team. So I think trying to figure out identities for these two, we'll kind of figure that out in November probably. But for now, they've got good talent, they've got good players, but as you know, Greg, in the SEC, everybody's got good talent, good players, and you just got to find that one thing that's going to help kind of separate you from the pack.
Yep, I am right there with you. And I do feel like we need to talk about this team as well because they're a team that not a lot of people have talked about here in the offseason because they haven't made a lot of signings. But I thought that it was very interesting in terms of Bart Torvik's projections. They had Georgia right around about 7th in the SEC, so in the upper half. I want to get your thoughts here because this is a school that it feels like both of us have had a tough time in terms of gauging over the last few seasons. We saw the flop that they had in the NCAA tournament last year, but unlike a lot of schools across college basketball, they're doing something called returning players. They haven't necessarily signed a lot of guys. Obviously, Florida's bringing back more than Georgia, but still, I want to get your thoughts here because it's so interesting to try to gauge a Georgia team that it felt like they were really all over the place last year, and it feels like they might be once again this year.
Well, and that's what we said, separator, right? Like, what separates Georgia? Well, yeah, I mean, like, retention is nice to have when you have a team that was pretty good last year, again, up until kind of just, having a little inconsistency, laying the egg in the tournament. But there are not a lot of teams that have their point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward back in the mix, right? And so I think from that standpoint, it's nice to have what you feel like is a pretty decent group of guys that already have that SEC experience. Maybe more importantly, they already have experience playing with each other. And we know sometimes that can be one of the biggest adjustments you have. But I mean, we're talking about, a Blue Kane who averaged 13 points a game. Catchings averages 12 a game. Kareem Stack could be a breakout type guy potentially. And I think that's the biggest thing to me is like, I look at this and I see, and I mentioned Smurf Melander also averaging 12 a game. So I think with Georgia, they feel like the team that I could see them staying at that same level. But the question is, right, are they going to be able to take another step forward? And I think that is going to be the big thing we're looking at with them, especially probably in non-conference play, those first couple months of the season. Is there something where just having these guys back in the mix for what was a great offensive team? Of course, their best offensive players now in Arkansas. If you have those other guys kind of pick up some of the slack, because I do think Kane, Smurf, and Catchings were the three best players beyond Jeremiah Wilkinson. Of course, Santos Cyril, it's hard to replace a guy like that. But I think there's a lot to like here when you just look at, again, the retention here for Georgia and then seeing, what a James Scott can do. Freddie DeLeon, obviously someone who was in the SEC initially at Tennessee. How does he add to kind of the backcourt mix there? And so when you start to go down the list, it's easy to feel like Georgia has a pretty decent floor. It's just kind of the same story, I think, Greg, that we always talk about with them, and it has been the same case over the past couple of years, is how high is the ceiling, right? That, to me, is the big question.
Yep, I'm right there with you. And there's a lot of question marks with regards to so many of these teams. We got a little bit more clarity with the NBA draft decisions over the last few days. And I know you, Blake, are trying to do a good job of putting together this puzzle that is the upcoming college basketball season. You've got your finger on the pulse of a little bit of everything. So let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
You always appreciate it, Greg. Yeah, check out all of our SEC stuff over at Southeastern 16. Yeah, we still got lots of SEC basketball stuff in the offseason, tying it into the national scene as well. So, yeah, you can get all of our thoughts on the SEC and college basketball over there at Southeastern 16. Everything else, you can follow me on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell.
And Blake is doing such a wonderful job looking at this amazing sports all 12 months out of the year. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights. So big thanks to Blake for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Coming next, let's take a look at the news and notes we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16, looking at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights. Did so once again today. So a big thanks to Blake for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you a recap of the news and notes we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. Bethune-Cookman is now making some moves. Jalen Jones, he was last year over at Jacksonville. He was averaging 9.5 points, 3.5 boards, 2.5 assists. Never been a great three-point shooter, but a 33% three-point shooter. Began his career over at Oakland and Tennessee State. He has decided that he is going to commit to Bethune-Cookman. I don't know if they're quite going to have the firepower that they did last year with Ontario Morris. And, well, they were supposed to have Dr. Bradley. Unfortunately, that never really panned out for them. But they've done a great job here in the offseason. Kevin Penn was a nice scorer over at San Diego. Spent the last few years over at New Mexico and USC is coming in. I do think that Jameel Morris, who comes in from within the conference over at Alcorn State, is going to be solid. I know that Kansas City was absolutely awful last year, but Carmelo Branch was a double-figure scorer over there. Corin Davis is a guy that knows the conference coming over from Alabama A&M. He should be able to give them some nice versatility at 6'7". Really like what Bethune-Cookman has been doing here. This is a good pickup for them, and we've seen a lot of SWAC teams here over the last few weeks do a good job in terms of being able to land some nice pickups. This is the latest of them, so do like that. You've got Keon Webb. He was over at Portland State this last season, and he has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Albany. Now, for Albany, this is a team that I do think has a little bit of upside to them, no doubt about it. For Albany, they need to be better with regards to the basics. They were 345th in the country with regards to their free throw shooting percentage last season, but they're bringing back Abdoulaye Fall, who was limited just 7 games last season, and Zach Matalu, he was able to average about 5.5 rebounds per game. They should be solid down low. I do have some question marks with regards to what you're going to get out of the backcourt. They still need to find that main trigger man, and Webb is certainly not going to be that. He's a 6'11" big man that couldn't get out there on the floor last year over at Portland State. 2 years ago over at San Diego, he was averaging like 3 points, 2.5 boards. He was able to see 10 starts. So he's a guy that I think is really going to be able to help this team out down low. And Albany might be the best low post team in the conference. They are also a team that is probably going to be one of the worst with regards to their backcourt as well. So going to be very interesting to take a look at that dynamic, but they beef up even more down low. So I do think that having that depth is very much clear that Albany, they're going to be looking to maximize there. And they are also going to be bringing in a guy, Mustafa Nato. He was playing over in Senegal, and he was also in Qatar, if I'm not mistaken, as well. They're going to look to him in the backcourt, a little bit of an international man of mystery. So Albany has very much been making some moves over the last 48 or so hours, and then this team is now making some moves as well. How about Siena bringing in Tan Yiziglu? He was a really good guard over at VMI. Not a guy that's going to light you up from three-point range, not a guy that is too much of a primary scorer or anything like that, but over at VMI, did a nice job in terms of doling it out last year. 4.7 assists, 10.5 points, 3.5 rebounds per game. Also threw in there a Siena Apricante. Shot just 27% from three-point range, but a 2-year starter. As we know, Siena, very much a new-look program because you lose Jerry McNamara in the offseason, and for Siena, they obviously had a really nice season last year, being able to make it to the NCAA tournament. They were able to give Duke a very nice charge there, but now with Nevada Smith at the helm, I know that he was an assistant over at Marquette. He's going to probably be looking to put his stamp on things a little bit more. I would expect Siena to be playing a little bit more up-tempo this season. I still think that they're going to be based around good, solid guard play. Last year under Jerry McNamara, they were also a very good team down low, and this is really the first main Division I guy that they're bringing in via the portal. So Siena, they have some work to do. They do bring back Reed Descharme, so he's a 6'6" combo player, began his career over at the Power Conference level. That helps him out a little bit, and they did retain a few guys, more than what you'd expect considering the coaching change, but no doubt about it, they're going to need to bring in a few more guys. This is a good starting spot. We'll see if they've got a little bit more here in the coming weeks, and this is a team that is looking to add as well. Mater Diop, he was over at Stetson this last season, was averaging about 3 points, 3 rebounds per game at 6'9". He's able to pop it from 3, but didn't necessarily do the world's greatest job in terms of being able to pop it and lock it from 3-point range, but he goes on over to Lindenwood, a Lindenwood team that was very solid on defense, but more of the forte of this Lindenwood defense was generating turnovers and being able to create a little bit of havoc there. They weren't necessarily a team that was amazing down low last season. Their 2-point shooting percentage defense was pretty solid, but they're not necessarily too much of a shot blocking team or anything like that. He just wasn't a very good fit over at Stetson. For Stetson, they're very much built around guard play. They're a team that is looking a lot more for 3-point shooting. Lindenwood, they don't care how you shoot from 3-point range because they've never been a very good 3-point shooting team. But for this Lindenwood team, they've really done a nice job in terms of stepping up and being able to just allocate more resources to college basketball. They were a D2 program for a very, very long time, and they pretty much moved up due to football in general. But here in the offseason, bringing in Xavier Spencer, he was about a 9 to 10 point per game score over at UMass Lowell's big. Dom Clay, he comes over from North Dakota State. That's a solid add. Miles White, he was able to do some things over at Lipscomb. This is really the first main, shall we say, low post presence that's going to be coming into the program. So I do like this one, and now you're getting a little bit more balance with regards to this Lindenwood team. and we're looking to balance things out on this podcast and give you guys all that is happening in this great sport. If you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one or two ways to be able to throw those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larry CM, they mean does not matter. So, as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And big thanks to our guy, Blake, for joining me in the last segment. And I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast. Here in the offseason, you're going to be getting all of the news and notes that we're seeing in this great sport. And as I was alluding to in the first segment, conference previews, they are coming soon, probably within the next, I would say, about 2 or so weeks. And then once we get in season, picks and analysis on every single game, every single day. So I appreciate you tuning in today. I'll be back to you once again tomorrow. Thank you.